Late at night, the room is quiet. The only sound is the soft glow of a laptop screen and the faint tapping of fingers that never quite begin the task they were meant to start. The document is open. The assignment is waiting. The idea is clear. And yet something invisible sits between intention and action. You tell yourself you'll start in a moment. Just one quick check of a message. Just one small scroll. Just one more minute to feel ready. But minutes stretch into half an hour. The task remains untouched, and a strange feeling slowly settles in your chest. It's not exactly laziness. It's not exactly distraction either. It feels more like a quiet pressure in the background of your mind. A voice whispers that you should start. Another voice gently pushes the moment away. This quiet tension is something millions of people experience every single day. A task sits right in front of them, clearly important, clearly necessary, and yet beginning feels strangely heavy. Not impossible, just heavy. You promise yourself something simple. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow you'll wake up early, feel motivated, sit down, and finally get things done the way disciplined people seem to do so easily. But tomorrow arrives, and the same pattern appears again. You sit down. You open the work. You prepare to begin. And once again, that invisible resistance quietly shows up. Over time, this pattern starts to shape how people see themselves. They begin to think maybe they are lazy. Maybe they simply lack discipline. Maybe successful people possess some kind of mental strength that they themselves are missing. And that thought can slowly become heavier than the work itself. But something interesting happens in certain moments. Sometimes the environment changes. The pressure disappears. The situation feels different somehow. And suddenly, without forcing anything, the same person becomes incredibly productive. They focus. They move quickly. They finish things they had been delaying for weeks. Which raises a quiet question that many people rarely ask. If procrastination were truly about laziness, how could the same person suddenly become so capable in the right conditions? What if the problem is not motivation? What if the real obstacle is how the mind experiences the beginning of effort? Because for many people, the hardest part of any task is not the work itself. It is the moment right before the work begins. Shocked that small doorway between thinking and doing. If that doorway feels heavy, the mind delays. If that doorway feels simple, action begins naturally. In Japan, many daily habits quietly revolve around this idea. Instead of forcing people to rely on willpower, many routines gently change the shape of the beginning. They make starting feel smaller than resistance. They make the first step feel light enough that the mind stops fighting it. And when starting becomes easier, something surprising often happens. Momentum appears on its own. Tonight, we're going to explore 7 Japanese habits that quietly remove the invisible weight that makes people procrastinate. These habits don't depend on extreme discipline, motivational speeches, or forcing yourself through resistance. Instead, they gently reshape the experience of beginning. And when the beginning changes, the entire relationship with work can change as well. For a long time, many people believed procrastination was simply a character flaw, a sign of laziness, a lack of discipline, something that needed to be fixed through stronger willpower and harsher self-control. So when people struggled to start their work, they didn't just feel delayed. They felt guilty. They blamed themselves. They told themselves things like, "I'm just not disciplined enough," or "I always ruin things by waiting too long." But modern psychology has slowly revealed something very different. In many cases, procrastination is not the mind refusing to work. It is the mind quietly trying to protect itself, not from the task itself, but from the emotions connected to the task. Sometimes a task carries uncertainty. You're not sure how well you'll do. The brain senses that uncertainty and interprets it as a potential threat. Sometimes a task carries the fear of failure. If you start, you might discover that you're not as capable as you hoped. Sometimes a task carries perfection pressure. You feel like it must be done perfectly, which makes beginning feel dangerous. And sometimes a task simply carries mental overload, too many decisions, too many steps, too many things happening at once. When the brain senses these emotions, it does something very natural. It delays, not because it is weak, but because it is trying to reduce discomfort. In many Western productivity cultures, this delay is treated like an enemy. The common advice becomes aggressive. Push harder. Wake up earlier. Force yourself to work. Beat laziness. But the strange thing about force is that it often increases resistance. When people begin treating every task like a battle, the mind starts associating work with stress. And when work feels stressful, the brain tries even harder to avoid it. It becomes a cycle. More pressure creates more avoidance. More avoidance creates more guilt. More guilt creates even heavier pressure. But many Japanese routines approach productivity in a very different way. Instead of increasing pressure, they quietly remove friction. Instead of demanding stronger discipline, they reshape the environment around the task. They make the task feel lighter before it even begins. The focus is not, how can I force myself to work? The focus is, how can I make starting feel so small that resistance fades away? This shift is subtle but powerful. When the first step becomes easy enough, the brain stops negotiating. It simply begins. And once the mind begins moving, something interesting often happens. The emotional barrier disappears, and the work itself no longer feels as heavy as it did before. This is why many Japanese productivity habits look surprisingly gentle from the outside. They are not built on intense motivation. They are built on quiet environmental design. Small adjustments in routine, space, and expectation that slowly change how the mind approaches action. The habits you're about to see are not extreme life hacks. They are not rigid systems that require perfect discipline. They are small shifts, small enough that the brain no longer needs to protect itself. And when that protection is no longer necessary, procrastination often fades on its own. Let's begin with the first habit. In many parts of the world, productivity advice begins with big expectations. Finish the project. Study for hours. Write thousands of words. Build momentum through intense focus and discipline. But the problem with large expectations is that the brain often reacts to them with quiet resistance. When a task feels large, uncertain, or overwhelming, the mind begins to hesitate before the first step even happens. Japanese productivity culture often approaches this moment differently. Instead of asking someone to complete a large task, the focus quietly shifts toward making the first action extremely small. This idea is deeply connected to the philosophy of gradual improvement that many people associate with Japanese thinking. Progress does not always begin with dramatic effort. It often begins with something almost surprisingly simple. Imagine sitting down to write an article. The mind immediately thinks about the entire process: research, structure, wording, editing, finishing. The brain sees the whole mountain at once, and the moment suddenly feels heavy. But instead of telling yourself to write the entire article, the starting action becomes something almost effortless. Open the document. That's it. No pressure to write well. No demand to finish anything. Just open the file. Or imagine studying for an exam. The thought of studying for 2 hours can trigger resistance before you even sit down. But if the first step becomes simply reading one paragraph, the task feels completely different. One paragraph is easy. One paragraph does not threaten the mind. And once that paragraph is finished, the brain often notices something interesting. The resistance that existed before starting has quietly disappeared. This happens because the brain often fears the uncertainty of beginning more than it fears the effort of continuing. The moment action starts, the mind shifts into motion. Dopamine begins to respond to progress instead of anxiety, and the task begins to feel manageable. This is why starting small is not about lowering standards. It is about lowering the threshold of entry. When the threshold becomes small enough, resistance loses its grip. Another habit often used in Japanese workspaces supports this idea in a very quiet way. It involves something called the visible beginning. Many people end a work session by closing everything completely. They shut the notebook. They close the laptop. They put materials away. The next time they return to the task, they must restart the entire decision process again. What should I work on first? Where should I begin? What was the next step? These tiny decisions create friction, and friction creates hesitation. Instead, some people leave the beginning of the next step visible before they stop working. A writer might leave the next sentence unfinished. A student might leave the next page open. A designer might leave the next file ready on the screen. When they return the next day, the starting point is already waiting for them. There is no decision to make, no moment of uncertainty. The environment quietly answers the question before the brain even asks it. This simple visual cue removes the small negotiation that often delays action. When the next step is visible, the mind naturally moves forward. It is a gentle psychological signal that says, "You already know where to begin." These two habits might look extremely small on the surface. Opening a document, leaving a notebook open, preparing the next step. But these tiny adjustments change something important. They remove the invisible friction that makes the mind hesitate. And when hesitation disappears, starting becomes natural instead of forced. The next Japanese habit focuses on something even deeper than starting actions. It focuses on the environment surrounding the mind itself. Sometimes procrastination does not come from the task itself. It comes from the environment surrounding the task. Many people try to solve procrastination by changing their mindset, but they rarely notice how strongly their physical space shapes their behavior. Imagine sitting down to work at a desk that is crowded with objects, papers stacked in different directions, notifications flashing on multiple screens, small distractions scattered everywhere. Even before you begin, your brain starts processing everything it sees. Every object quietly asks for attention. Every notification suggests another action. Every unfinished item reminds the mind of something else that needs to be done. Without realizing it, the brain becomes overloaded before the task even begins. In Japan, many traditional spaces are designed very differently. If you look at traditional rooms with tatami floors or minimalist interiors, something feels noticeably calm. The environment is simple, clear surfaces, limited visual noise. Only the objects that are truly necessary remain present. This kind of space quietly changes the way the brain feels. When the environment contains fewer signals, the mind processes fewer decisions. Cognitive load decreases. The brain does not have to sort through layers of visual information before focusing. In a simplified environment, the task in front of you becomes the most obvious thing in the room. And when the task becomes visually dominant, the mind naturally gravitates toward it. This is not about strict minimalism or perfectly empty spaces. It is about reducing the small visual tensions that pull the brain in different directions. Even small changes can create this effect. Clearing unnecessary objects from a desk, closing unused tabs, removing visual clutter that constantly competes for attention. These adjustments send a quiet signal to the brain. This space is meant for focus. When the environment becomes calmer, the mind often becomes calmer as well. But the Japanese approach to reducing resistance does not stop with space. It also changes how time is experienced during work. Many people procrastinate because tasks feel endless. When the brain believes a task has no clear boundary, it begins to resist starting. The mind imagines hours of effort, fatigue, and pressure stretching into the future. And when effort feels infinite, the brain delays beginning. Instead of approaching work as an open-ended demand, many Japanese productivity routines quietly create time containers. Rather than saying, "I must finish everything today," the mindset becomes much simpler. "I will work on this for 20 minutes, or sometimes even less. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. A short, clearly defined period." When time is limited in this way, something changes inside the mind. The task no longer feels like a massive obligation. It becomes a temporary activity with a clear ending. The brain relaxes. The resistance that once protected you from endless effort is no longer necessary. You are not committing to finishing the entire project. You are simply agreeing to focus for a short window of time. And very often, once that time window begins, momentum naturally appears. People who plan to work for 10 minutes sometimes continue for 30. People who expected 20 minutes often finish far more than they imagined. But the key difference is that the mind was never forced. It was invited. These small time containers make action feel safe to begin. And when starting feels safe, procrastination slowly loses its power. Yet there is another quiet habit in Japanese culture that changes how people relate to work entirely. It has nothing to do with environment or time. It has to do with the way consistency is viewed. In many cultures, productivity is often associated with intensity. People admire long hours, bursts of motivation, dramatic effort, and the ability to push through exhaustion. Success stories are usually told in terms of extreme discipline and relentless work. But intensity has a hidden cost. When people believe that productivity requires large amounts of energy and motivation, the brain quietly begins to delay the moment of starting. If every work session is expected to be intense, the mind waits for the perfect moment to feel ready. And that perfect moment rarely arrives. This is one reason procrastination becomes so common. The expectation of intensity makes every task feel heavier before it even begins. In contrast, many Japanese habits are built around something much gentler: consistency, not dramatic effort, not heroic bursts of productivity, just small actions repeated quietly over time. In many Japanese crafts, arts, and professions, the focus is not on doing something perfectly once. The focus is on returning to the practice again and again in small, steady steps. A writer may write only a little each day. An artist may sketch for a short period daily. A student may review a few concepts every evening. The effort may appear modest on any single day, but over time something powerful happens. The action becomes part of the person's identity. Instead of asking, "Do I feel motivated today?" the question becomes something much simpler. What is the smallest version of this habit I can do today? When the expected effort is small, the brain no longer needs to negotiate with resistance. The task does not threaten energy or emotional comfort. It simply becomes part of the rhythm of daily life. This gentle approach removes the drama that often surrounds productivity. There is no need to wait for inspiration. There is no need to push through exhaustion. There is simply a quiet return to the habit each day. And something surprising often emerges from this pattern. Momentum. When people engage with a task consistently, even in small amounts, their brain begins to recognize it as familiar territory. The uncertainty disappears. The emotional weight fades. Over time, the habit becomes easier to begin than to avoid. This is the quiet power of consistency. Intensity may create dramatic short-term results, but consistency quietly reshapes behavior over the long term. And when expectations become gentle instead of extreme, the mind stops resisting the act of starting. Yet even with consistency and a calm environment, many people still feel something heavy when they approach certain tasks, not because of the effort involved, but because of what the task seems to say about them. The next Japanese habit addresses this hidden emotional layer. For many people, work slowly becomes tied to identity. A finished task feels like proof that you are capable. A delayed task begins to feel like evidence that something is wrong with you. Over time, this connection grows stronger. Every assignment, every project, every responsibility begins to carry emotional meaning far beyond the work itself. If you perform well, you feel worthy. If you struggle to begin, you feel inadequate. This emotional weight quietly changes the way the brain approaches tasks. The moment you sit down to start something important, the mind is no longer thinking only about the work. It is also thinking about what the outcome might say about you. What if you fail? What if it isn't good enough? What if you discover you're not as capable as you hoped? These thoughts can appear silently, often without you even noticing them. But the brain notices. And when the brain senses a possible threat to identity, it responds in the same way it responds to other forms of emotional discomfort. It delays. Procrastination, in this sense, becomes a way to postpone judgment. If you never fully start the task, the result cannot fully evaluate you. But this also traps people in a painful cycle. The longer they delay, the more the task feels connected to their self-worth, and the heavier the task becomes. In many Japanese work cultures, there is often a quieter emotional relationship with tasks. The task itself is treated as something separate from the person performing it. If a task is unfinished, it is simply unfinished. If a task contains mistakes, it is simply part of the learning process. The work exists outside of identity. This emotional distance removes a large amount of psychological pressure. When a task is no longer a reflection of personal worth, the fear surrounding it begins to dissolve. You are not the task. You are simply the person performing the task. And like any activity, it can be started, paused, adjusted, or improved without turning it into a story about who you are. This subtle shift can change how the brain reacts to beginning. When the task no longer carries emotional judgment, the mind no longer needs to protect itself from the outcome. The work becomes neutral again. And neutral tasks are far easier to begin than emotionally loaded ones. Instead of asking yourself whether the work will prove something about you, the mind simply focuses on the next action. One step, one movement, one small moment of progress, and often that is enough to move forward. There is one final Japanese habit that quietly supports all of these ideas. It focuses on the moment when the mind transitions from rest into action. In many parts of life, the most difficult moment is not the work itself. It is the quiet transition between not doing and doing. That small space where the mind must shift from rest into action. For many people, this moment feels abrupt. One minute they are relaxing, checking messages, or thinking about something else. The next moment, they expect themselves to suddenly become focused and productive. The brain rarely likes sudden transitions. It prefers gradual shifts. This is why many Japanese traditions begin activities with small rituals. If you observe something like a traditional tea preparation, the process moves slowly and deliberately. Each step is simple. Each motion prepares the mind for the next one. The ritual is not about efficiency. It is about entering a state of attention. Over time, the brain begins to associate the ritual with a specific mental state. When the ritual begins, the mind quietly understands that it is time to focus. This same idea can be applied to everyday work. Instead of forcing yourself to jump directly into a difficult task, you begin with a small, consistent action that always happens before work starts. It might be making a cup of tea. It might be opening your notebook and writing the date. It might be turning on a desk lamp or adjusting your chair. The action itself is not important. What matters is that it happens every time before you begin. After repeating the ritual enough times, something interesting happens. The brain begins to treat that small action as a doorway. When the ritual appears, the mind shifts into work mode naturally. There is no internal argument, no long negotiation, just a familiar transition. This is why rituals can quietly reduce procrastination. They replace the uncomfortable moment of starting with something predictable and calming. Instead of forcing yourself into focus, you walk through a small sequence that gently leads you there. And often, by the time the ritual is finished, the hardest part has already passed. You have already begun. When you look back at these habits, something important becomes clear. None of them rely on extreme willpower. They do not demand perfect discipline. They do not require constant motivation. Instead, they quietly reshape the conditions surrounding action. They make the beginning smaller. They make the environment calmer. They reduce emotional pressure. They create gentle routines that guide the mind into movement. Procrastination rarely disappears through force alone. The mind tends to resist when it feels pushed too hard. But when starting becomes simple and safe, the mind often stops resisting. If you have struggled with procrastination, it does not necessarily mean you lack discipline. It may simply mean the beginning has been too heavy. Too many expectations. Of focus. A ritual that gently begins the of focus. A ritual that gently begins the process. And when the beginning becomes light enough, something surprising often happens. Momentum appears on its own. The mind moves forward not because it is forced, but because the path no longer feels heavy. Sometimes progress does not come from pushing harder. Sometimes it comes from making the first step kinder to the mind that must take it.